A wealthy construction billionaire, still grieving the loss of his wife and struggling to raise his paralyzed son alone in a massive mansion outside Seattle, became deeply suspicious of everyone around him after a series of betrayals by former employees. When a new maid was hired to care for his son, he didn't trust her calm smile or gentle presence. Fearing that she might be just like the others who had stolen from him or sold private information, he secretly installed hidden cameras in every room of the house, including his son's bedroom, determined to catch her doing something wrong. He watched her every move day and night, convinced she was hiding something behind her kindness. But as he kept observing her interactions with his son, something completely unexpected began to unfold right in front of his eyes. Something that would soon change not only his opinion of her, but his entire understanding of what had been missing from their lives. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Jonathan Wallace was a very rich man who made his fortune in the construction industry. He owned one of the biggest construction companies in the country. After his wife died in a tragic car accident and his only son, Ethan, became paraplegic because of the same crash, Jonathan chose to live far from people. He moved with Ethan to a huge mansion located in a quiet area near Seattle. The mansion had tall gates, many rooms, and was surrounded by trees, but it was always cold and empty. Jonathan stopped trusting people. He didn't like visits, and he avoided conversations that weren't necessary. He was still hurt by everything that happened. He didn't want to take any risks again. His days were quiet but full of caution. He spent most of his time working from home and watching over Ethan, who used a wheelchair. Jonathan's life was no longer about joy or connection. It was about control, safety, and protecting what was left of his family. Since the accident, Jonathan became extremely suspicious of everyone around him. In less than a year, he had hired and fired 4 different housekeepers. The first one was caught stealing jewelry from the master bedroom. Jonathan found out by checking the camera recordings himself. The second housekeeper took secret pictures inside the house, including private areas and expensive items, and sold them online. When Jonathan discovered this, he fired her on the same day. The third seemed kind, but she had been selling information about the family and the house to the media. News websites published things no one outside the mansion could know. This was the final blow for Jonathan's trust. The fourth housekeeper appeared honest, but one day she disappeared. Later, Jonathan's company noticed that a large amount of money was missing from one of the accounts. She had run away with the money. All of this made Jonathan believe that no one could be trusted, no matter how nice they seemed. These events affected Jonathan deeply. Each betrayal left a scar on his mind. He started seeing every new person as a possible threat. He didn't allow workers to stay in the house alone. Every visitor had to go through tight security. Cameras were placed in every hallway, every room except Ethan's, and outside the mansion. He reviewed the footage almost daily. He didn't hire people directly anymore. Instead, he worked with background check agencies, asking them to investigate every detail about potential employees. Even when someone passed all the checks, he still kept them at a distance. He gave simple orders, avoided small talk, and always watched closely. At night, he double-checked the locks and alarm systems before going to bed. His fear of being betrayed again was stronger than any desire for friendship or connection. The walls of the mansion weren't just physical, they were emotional barriers. Jonathan built them high to protect himself and Ethan from any more pain caused by others. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was cold, not just because of the stone floors or high ceilings, but because of the way Jonathan lived. There were no family pictures on the walls. The furniture was expensive, but the rooms felt empty. Every space looked perfect, but it lacked life. There were no sounds of laughter, no casual conversations, no warmth. Jonathan spent most of his time in his office working. He avoided walking around the house without a purpose. Ethan stayed mostly in his room, which was specially designed for his needs. Even between father and son, the relationship was distant. Jonathan loved Ethan deeply, but he didn't know how to show it anymore. He was afraid that if he let his guard down, something terrible would happen again. So he chose to stay strong and serious all the time. He believed that if he kept things under control, he could avoid more suffering. But in doing so, he also avoided comfort, happiness, and emotional closeness. Ethan felt the weight of the silence around him. Even though he had everything a child could ask for, electronics, books, games, and a room adapted for his wheelchair, he missed the feeling of being part of a real family. He remembered when his mother was alive and how different everything was. The house they lived in back then was smaller, but it was filled with life. Now everything was perfect on the outside, but empty inside. Ethan often looked at his father with sadness. He knew Jonathan loved him, but the way his father kept pushing people away made the loneliness worse. Sometimes, Ethan tried to talk about it, but Jonathan would change the subject. He didn't want to appear weak. He believed that focusing on protection was more important than emotional talks. Ethan missed having someone to talk to freely. He missed being hugged without reason. In a house full of luxury, the thing that was missing the most was connection, and both father and son felt it, silently. Over time, Jonathan's way of living became his only way. He was surrounded by cameras, locked doors, and detailed background checks. He rarely left the property and avoided contact with outsiders. He didn't go to parties or events anymore. Business meetings happened online. The only people allowed near Ethan were doctors and therapists, and even they were watched carefully. Jonathan was not trying to be cruel. He was scared. After so many betrayals, he decided that it was better to live in fear than to live in pain again. The mansion, with its cold walls and silent rooms, was a reflection of that fear. It showed how one man, after losing too much, chose control over trust, isolation over connection. Jonathan believed he was doing the right thing, that this way he was keeping Ethan safe, but in truth, he was just building more distance between them. The mansion stood still, holding both their lives, as the days passed with no change, only silence and caution. One morning, a young woman named Grace Miller arrived at the Wallace mansion. She'd been sent by a professional agency to work as a caregiver for Ethan, Jonathan Wallace's son. Grace came from a modest background. She didn't wear fancy clothes or carry expensive items. Her expression was calm, and her voice was soft. She stood at the door, holding a small bag, waiting to be let in. When the security guard confirmed her identity, she was led through the large, cold halls of the mansion to meet Jonathan. He didn't greet her warmly. He looked serious and distant. He told her that there were strict rules in his house. No pictures were allowed. She was not allowed to talk to anyone outside about the family. She should keep her distance from him at all times. Grace nodded quietly. She listened without asking questions. After the short conversation, she was taken to Ethan's room to begin her work. The house felt cold and unfriendly, but she didn't complain. At first, Grace did her job carefully and quietly. She didn't ask anything personal. She followed all the instructions and moved around the house only when needed. The mansion was big, but the atmosphere was heavy. Everyone walked with caution. The other workers didn't speak much. Grace noticed how quiet Ethan was when she entered his room. He didn't greet her. He just looked at her without emotion. Still, Grace smiled and introduced herself in a gentle way. She didn't push him to talk. Instead, she began helping with small tasks. She adjusted his blanket, helped him get comfortable in his chair, and offered to read him a story. At first, He said no, but she kept coming every day, speaking softly and showing care in simple actions. She brought storybooks and tried singing old songs that children used to like. Slowly, Ethan began to respond. He started to listen. Sometimes he looked at her longer. Eventually, he smiled for the first time in a long while. As days passed, Ethan's behavior began to change. He started waiting for Grace in the mornings. When she entered the room, he greeted her with a quiet, "Hi." He listened to her stories and even asked questions. Grace never forced any activity on him. She simply gave him choices, and he began to choose more often. She suggested easy games they could play together, and Ethan agreed. She also sang songs from his childhood that his mother used to sing. That made Ethan remember good moments from the past. Grace noticed these small reactions and used them to connect with him more. She was always kind, never too loud or too serious. The other workers in the house noticed the change in Ethan. They were surprised by how much more cheerful he seemed. Some of them had been there for months and never saw him like that. Grace had brought a new energy into the house, but not everyone saw her actions in a positive way. Jonathan watched everything from a distance. He didn't miss a single detail. While the other staff members started to appreciate Grace's work, Jonathan became more suspicious. He didn't trust changes that happened too fast. In his mind, kindness was often a trap. He believed people wore fake smiles to hide selfish goals. Grace's calm attitude and patience didn't reassure him. They made him uncomfortable. He told the security team to check all the cameras more often. He asked for detailed reports about Grace's movements, behavior, and time spent with Ethan. He read every report and watched parts of the video footage himself. If she spent more than a few minutes talking to other staff members, he wanted to know why. If she left the room and came back with something in her hand, he wanted to see what it was. Jonathan told himself that he was doing this to protect his son. He didn't want Ethan to get hurt again, emotionally or otherwise. Even though Grace did nothing wrong, Jonathan continued to believe she had something to hide. He remembered all the other people who had fooled him in the past. They had also smiled. They had also pretended to be honest. He couldn't allow another person to get close and then betray them. So he kept watching her. He also avoided her completely. He never spoke to her again after the first day. If she passed by in a hallway, he looked the other way. If she asked something through a staff member, he gave short, direct answers. He didn't want to know about her background, her personal story, or her reasons for taking the job. In Jonathan's mind, knowing someone made you weak, and being weak opened the door for disappointment. But no matter how much he tried to avoid her, he couldn't ignore the fact that Ethan was laughing again. That alone made him unsure of what to think. Still, he chose to stay on guard. Grace continued her work the same way every day. She stayed calm, even though she felt the coldness from Jonathan. She could feel that she was being watched, but she didn't let that stop her. She focused on Ethan, helping him grow stronger emotionally. Her presence brought lightness to his routine. She didn't ask about Jonathan or the past. She didn't push to be accepted. She just did her work with care and dedication. Ethan looked happier. He spoke more. He even asked to go outside in his wheelchair, something he hadn't done in months. The staff admired Grace for her calm strength, but Jonathan didn't let his guard down. He told himself it was just a matter of time until she made a mistake. He believed she was just like the others, pretending until she got what she wanted. He was ready to catch her. So even as Grace helped bring smiles back to the house, Jonathan kept his eyes open, sure that she would try to deceive him too. That week, Jonathan decided to take a step further in monitoring Grace. He had already been watching her through the regular cameras, but now he wanted more. He didn't want to rely only on what others told him or what basic security footage showed. So he hired a private team to install hidden cameras all around the house. These weren't the usual visible cameras in corners. These were small, well-placed devices hidden in shelves, lamps, and behind decorative objects. He wanted full coverage. The living room, the kitchen, every hallway, and even Ethan's bedroom. Jonathan told the technicians to be discreet. No one should know about this, not even the house staff. His goal was to catch Grace doing something wrong before it was too late. He didn't trust her kindness, her smile, or the way she acted with Ethan. He believed it was all a performance. He told himself he was just being smart, collecting proof before betrayal happened again, like it always had before. After the cameras were installed, Jonathan began checking the video feeds constantly. He linked them to his phone and tablet so he could watch from anywhere. Every night, after everyone had gone to sleep, he stayed awake in his office, watching the footage alone. He looked for anything strange. A secret phone call, a hidden message, an item going missing, or a conversation between Grace and another worker. He expected to find something wrong eventually. He watched hours of recordings, but nothing suspicious came up. Grace didn't sneak around. She didn't touch anything she shouldn't. She followed her routine every day. She helped Ethan in the morning, cleaned his room, read to him, and played games. At night, she folded his clothes and stayed by his side until he fell asleep. She didn't complain, didn't gossip, didn't cross any boundaries. Jonathan saw all of it, but still refused to believe it was real. He convinced himself she was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As he kept watching, something began to change. Jonathan found himself focusing not on catching Grace, but on her way of being with Ethan. Her actions weren't forced. She seemed truly present. She laughed when Ethan told jokes, even simple ones. She listened carefully when he spoke. She sang softly when he was tired, always picking calm, familiar songs. Sometimes she sat on the floor with him just to play a board game. Jonathan saw Ethan laughing, really laughing, and it made him stop and think. It had been months, maybe longer, since he had seen his son smile like that. Grace wasn't doing anything wrong. In fact, she was doing everything right, but even this made Jonathan uncomfortable. It was easier for him to believe she was faking, because if she was truly kind, then maybe he was the one doing something wrong by doubting her. Still, he kept watching every day. The cameras had been placed to catch lies, but all he was seeing was honesty. One afternoon, Jonathan checked the camera feed from his phone while sitting alone in his office. The footage showed Grace and Ethan in the boy's bedroom. Ethan was in his wheelchair, and Grace was helping him do some light arm exercises. She encouraged him gently, saying he was getting stronger. Then, something unexpected happened. Ethan placed his hands on the sides of the chair and pushed down with all his strength. Slowly, shakily, he began to lift his body. He didn't stand completely, but his legs moved slightly. Grace didn't panic or stop him. She supported him by the shoulders and told him to go at his own pace. Ethan laughed, surprised at what he managed to do. He looked proud. From his office, Jonathan watched everything in silence. His hand lowered the phone to his lap, but his eyes stayed wide. He hadn't expected this. It wasn't just progress. It was a moment of pure courage from his son and support from someone he didn't fully trust. Jonathan stayed still in his chair, staring at the paused screen on his phone. His thoughts were racing. He remembered all the doctors who said Ethan might never recover movement in his lower body. He thought about the many months of therapy and silence that had followed the accident. He had almost given up hope of seeing Ethan try something like that again, and yet there it was, caught on hidden camera, not during a session with a specialist, but during a quiet afternoon with Grace. Watching his son laugh after such an effort triggered something inside him. Jonathan felt something tightening in his chest. His throat became dry, and his eyes started to burn. He wiped his face quickly, but the tears kept coming. He wasn't used to crying anymore. He didn't even know what to call the emotion he felt. Was it guilt for suspecting Grace? Was it pride in Ethan? Or was it something else, something more difficult to explain? He couldn't say. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt something stronger than suspicion. He had spent so long expecting the worst that he didn't know how to deal with something good. Grace hadn't lied. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't crossed the line. All she had done was care, truly care, for Ethan. And maybe, just maybe, that was what Ethan had needed all along. Jonathan looked at the phone screen again. Ethan's smile was still there, frozen in the paused video. Grace's hands were steady on his back, offering support without control. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He didn't make any decisions that night. He didn't speak to Grace or tell anyone what he saw, but inside, something had shifted. He still didn't trust easily, and the cameras stayed where they were. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something different. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something closer to hope, and it made him feel human again. One afternoon, while cleaning Jonathan's office, Grace moved quietly between the furniture. The room was large, filled with books, old documents, and several framed photographs on the shelves. She dusted each item carefully, trying not to disturb anything important. As she wiped a corner of the desk, she noticed a small picture frame lying face down. She picked it up gently and looked at it. It was an old family portrait. In the photo, Jonathan appeared younger, standing beside his wife and holding little Ethan in his arms. Behind them stood an older man, Jonathan's father, smiling proudly. Grace stared at the picture for a few seconds. She whispered softly, "He had such a kind look in his eyes," speaking to herself without realizing the cameras were recording. After that, she put the frame back in its place and continued her work, unaware that those few words would soon change everything in the house and in Jonathan's mind. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his office, checking the recordings from the hidden cameras, as he usually did. He liked to review everything before going to bed, convinced that one day he would catch Grace doing something suspicious. As he scrolled through the video files, he noticed the clip of her cleaning his office. He pressed play and watched carefully. There was nothing unusual at first, just Grace dusting and organizing things. Then she stopped at the photo. Jonathan leaned closer to the screen. When she lifted the frame and spoke, his heart started to beat faster. He turned the volume up and heard her say the words clearly. He had such a kind look in his eyes. Jonathan froze. How could she know that? Why would she say something like that? The thought began to bother him. He rewound the video several times, trying to understand her tone. To him, it didn't sound casual. It sounded personal, like someone remembering a person they had met before. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk, staring at the paused image of Grace holding the picture. Doubts filled his mind. How could she possibly know his father? The man had died many years ago, long before she was ever hired. There was no reason for her to make such a comment unless she had a hidden connection to the family. His head filled with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe Grace had planned her way into the house. Maybe she was pretending to care for Ethan to get close to him. The idea made his chest tighten. For Jonathan, every coincidence was a warning sign. He had been betrayed before, and now his instincts screamed that something was wrong again. He remembered how every other person who had earned his trust had eventually turned against him. He couldn't ignore this. He decided to act. He told himself he wasn't being paranoid, he was being careful, protecting his family from another hidden threat. The next morning, when Grace went outside with Ethan for a short walk in the garden, Jonathan saw an opportunity. He entered her room quietly, making sure no one saw him. The room was simple and tidy. Her bed was neatly made, and her few personal belongings were organized on a small table. Jonathan began searching through her things with quick, nervous movements. He opened drawers, checked under the bed, and looked inside her closet. Finally, he reached her bag. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside, he found a few basic items, some folded clothes, a small wallet, and a silver locket. The locket caught his attention immediately. It looked old, slightly worn, as if it had been kept for many years. He opened it carefully, and inside he saw two small photos. One was of his father. The other was a woman he didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he stared at it, feeling anger, fear, and confusion all at once. Jonathan sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the locket tightly in his hand. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Why would Grace have a picture of his father? And who was the woman next to him in the photo? The image looked genuine, not edited. His mind raced with explanations. Was Grace related to that woman somehow? Was she connected to something from his father's past? The more he thought, the less sense it made, but he couldn't stop imagining the worst. In his mind, this was no coincidence. It was a plan. A carefully built lie meant to trick him again. He felt betrayed before any real proof existed. His heartbeat was fast, his jaw tight. For him, the locket was the evidence he needed. Grace wasn't just another worker. She was someone with secrets, someone pretending to be innocent while hiding her real motives. He convinced himself that he had uncovered something big, something dangerous. From that day forward, Jonathan's suspicion grew stronger. He watched Grace more closely than ever, checking the cameras several times a day. Every move she made seemed suspicious now. If she smiled, he wondered why. If she talked to Ethan for too long, he imagined what they were discussing. The more he observed her, the more his fear grew. He couldn't confront her yet. He needed to be sure. But in his mind, the truth was already clear. The picture in the locket, her comment about his father, her calm attitude, it all looked like a performance. Jonathan believed he had finally uncovered the reason for her kindness. He was convinced that Grace was part of a plan, something designed to get close to his family for a reason he didn't yet understand. His paranoia took full control. Every look, every word, every smile from her became another piece of a puzzle he was building inside his head, one that existed only in his imagination. The following days were tense and heavy inside the Wallace mansion. Jonathan could barely focus on work. Every time he looked at Grace through the security cameras, his thoughts filled with suspicion. He watched how she spoke to Ethan, how she moved, how she touched objects in the house. Every small action looked suspicious to him now. If she smiled, he saw manipulation. If she stayed quiet, he imagined she was hiding something. The locket he had found in her belongings had changed everything in his mind. He felt angry at himself for feeling weak or uncertain. He believed he had been fooled again. His chest burned with frustration. Jonathan began sleeping less, checking the cameras late at night, and reading the agency files about her again and again. None of it showed anything wrong, but he refused to believe it. His fear spoke louder than reason. Finally, when he couldn't stand the tension anymore, he decided to call Grace into his office and confront her directly. When Grace entered the office, she looked calm, but a little confused. Jonathan stood behind his desk, his arms crossed, his face hard and serious. She greeted him politely, but he didn't respond. The silence lasted several seconds before he spoke. His tone was sharp and cold. He asked her if she had been hiding something, if she had known his father before working there, and if she had been sent by someone to spy on him. Grace didn't understand what he meant. She shook her head and said softly that she didn't know his father, that she had never done anything wrong. But Jonathan didn't believe her. He raised his voice, accusing her of lying and pretending to care about Ethan just to get close to the family. Grace tried to explain, but he interrupted her again and again. His anger grew stronger with each word. He told her he knew people like her, people who acted innocent to hide their true intentions. Grace's face turned pale. She had never seen Jonathan like that before. His voice was full of anger, but she could also sense fear behind it. She didn't shout back. She just stood there, trying to defend herself calmly. She said she loved taking care of Ethan and that she would never do anything to hurt him. Jonathan didn't listen. He slammed his hand on the desk and told her to stop pretending. He said he didn't want liars in his house. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She told him she didn't understand what he was accusing her of, but she would leave if that was what he wanted. Jonathan, trying to hide his emotions, said that was exactly what he wanted, for her to pack her things and go immediately. Grace nodded, wiping her tears, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned around and said in a quiet, trembling voice that he was making a mistake. Then she left without another word, leaving the office in silence. When Ethan found out what had happened, he couldn't stop crying. He begged his father to bring Grace back. He said she hadn't done anything wrong and that she was the only one who made him feel happy again. But Jonathan stayed firm, pretending not to care. He said she wasn't who they thought she was, that she had lied about something important. Ethan shouted that it wasn't true. He told his father that Grace was good, that she was kind, and that she helped him believe in himself again. His words cut deep into Jonathan's heart, but he didn't let it show. He ordered the driver to take Grace to the city and remove her from the staff list immediately. Ethan wheeled himself to his room and locked the door, crying alone. Jonathan stood in the hallway, feeling something heavy inside him, but he convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that he was only protecting his family from being hurt again. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Jonathan sat in his office, unable to sleep. The silence felt unbearable. For some reason, he opened the folder containing all the footage from the cameras. He told himself it would help him confirm his decision. He wanted to see something, anything, that proved Grace wasn't who she claimed to be. He started reviewing the recordings, one by one. Hours passed as he watched her daily routine, cleaning, helping Ethan, preparing meals, organizing his desk. There was nothing wrong. She didn't talk to strangers, didn't make suspicious calls, didn't act out of line. Then one video caught his attention. It was from Ethan's bedroom, recorded earlier that week. Jonathan pressed play and watched as Grace tucked Ethan into bed. She kissed the boy's forehead and said softly, "You're going to walk again. I promise." Her voice was warm and honest. Jonathan's throat tightened. He paused the video, staring at her kind expression frozen on the screen. At that moment, everything inside him broke. He covered his face with his hands, trying to hold back the tears, but they came anyway. He had spent years living in fear, seeing enemies everywhere, and now he realized what he had done. He hadn't been protecting Ethan. He had been pushing away the only person who truly cared. Grace wasn't a threat. She was a good woman who had brought light back into their lives. And he had destroyed it because he couldn't trust anyone anymore. The guilt hit him hard. He remembered the way she looked when she left, the tears in her eyes, and the pain in Ethan's voice when he begged for her to stay. Jonathan stayed up all night, watching the same video over and over again. The words, "You're going to walk again, I promise," echoed in his mind. For the first time in many years, he didn't feel anger or suspicion. He only felt regret, deep, painful regret, and a kind of sadness he couldn't escape. 2 days after being fired, Grace returned to the Wallace mansion. She was not alone. A police officer stood beside her as she waited at the gate. She had contacted the local station to report that she had been wrongly accused and unfairly dismissed. Her goal was simple: to prove her innocence. She wanted a chance to explain her side and clear her name. The officer was there only to supervise and take notes in case the situation got worse. Jonathan was informed by security that Grace was outside with a cop. He didn't look surprised. With a cold and distant tone, he allowed her to come in, but only to speak. He didn't welcome her or offer a seat. He stood straight behind his desk, arms crossed, looking at her with no expression. Grace stayed calm. Her face looked tired, but her voice was firm. She repeated that she had done nothing wrong and that she deserved to be heard. Jonathan kept his eyes locked on her. Without wasting time, Jonathan showed her the same two things he had used to build his accusations: the hidden camera footage where she commented on his father's photo, and the silver locket he had found in her bag. He replayed the video and then held the locket up, convinced this was the proof of her dishonesty. Grace didn't seem surprised. She didn't panic or try to avoid the subject. She calmly explained that the locket had belonged to her mother. It was a keepsake passed down after she died. She also said her mother had once worked for Jonathan's parents many years ago, back when Grace was still a child. She had heard many stories about the Wallace family while growing up. That's why she recognized his father and said what she said. It wasn't a secret, and it wasn't planned. It was simply part of her past. But to Jonathan, the story felt like another lie built to sound honest. The police officer listened and took notes while the two spoke. Grace tried to remain respectful, even as she defended herself. She said she had never intended to deceive anyone, and that her only goal had been to care for Ethan with kindness and respect. Jonathan didn't argue or shout this time. He let her speak, but his expression didn't change. He nodded once, as if to say he had heard enough. Then he told the officer that the matter was internal and no crime had taken place, just a misunderstanding between employer and employee. He said she was free to go, but wasn't welcome in the house anymore. Grace stood there quietly, clearly hurt, but said nothing more. The officer closed his notepad and motioned to leave. Grace took one last look around the house, then walked out with the same calm she had shown when she arrived. Jonathan stayed behind, telling himself again that he had done what was necessary, even if it didn't feel right anymore. The news didn't stay quiet for long. That same week, a local newspaper reported that Grace Miller, a caregiver, had been removed from a wealthy family's home under suspicion of dishonesty. The article didn't go into details, but it was enough to damage her reputation. Another family who had already shown interest in hiring her changed their mind after seeing the news. Grace received a short message from the agency saying they could no longer recommend her for future jobs. Just like that, she was left without work, without references, and without support. She didn't tell anyone what had really happened. She didn't try to defend herself in public. She stayed in her small apartment, avoiding calls and ignoring the newspaper articles. The silver locket remained with her, the only piece of her mother's past she had left. She placed it carefully in a drawer and didn't open it again. The pain of being wrongly accused and humiliated stayed with her in silence. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere grew darker. Ethan noticed her absence more and more each day. At first, he asked about her, hoping she would return soon. When no one gave him a real answer, he became quieter. He stopped smiling. He refused to go outside. He didn't want to play or read. He barely spoke to anyone. Jonathan thought it would pass, that Ethan just needed time. But things only got worse. Ethan began refusing food. He pushed his meals away or simply ignored them. The nurses tried everything, but nothing worked. He didn't want television, games, or books. When they spoke to him, he just repeated Grace's name, sometimes in tears. "Where's Grace?" he asked over and over again. No one could answer. Jonathan watched helplessly. He didn't know what to do. Every time he saw Ethan suffer, the weight in his chest grew heavier. He had wanted to protect his son, but now all he saw was pain, and he was the one who caused it. Ethan's sadness affected the entire house. Staff members whispered in hallways, unsure of what had really happened between Jonathan and Grace. Everyone saw the change in Ethan. Everyone saw the mistake, except Jonathan, who still refused to admit it out loud. At night, he sat alone again, looking through camera recordings he had already watched many times. But now, He didn't look for evidence of lies. He looked for the moments he had missed, the moments of care and love that had been in front of him the whole time. He watched Grace smile at Ethan, laugh with him, hold his hand, and whisper kind words. He saw her patience, her gentleness, her quiet strength. He remembered the look on her face when she left, and the pain in Ethan's voice as he cried for her. The recordings didn't show a criminal. They showed someone who had truly cared, but it was too late. Grace was gone, Ethan was heartbroken, and Jonathan was left alone, facing the damage his fear had caused. A few days after Grace had been removed from the mansion, Jonathan received a call from the private detective he had hired weeks before. The man said the investigation was finally complete and that he had prepared a full report. Jonathan asked him to come to the house right away. He didn't show emotion over the phone, but inside, he felt uneasy. When the detective arrived, he handed Jonathan a thick folder. He said everything inside had been double-checked and confirmed. Jonathan took it without saying much and sat down in his office to read. He didn't call anyone, didn't ask for coffee, didn't even turn on the lights. He sat alone, flipping through the pages one by one. The first part of the report focused on Grace's background. It clearly showed that Grace hadn't lied. Her mother, Margaret Miller, had worked for Jonathan's parents many years ago as their housekeeper. She had stayed with them for more than 5 years and left only after falling seriously ill. The report included old employment records, letters of recommendation, and even photos of Margaret standing beside the Wallace family at holiday events. Jonathan stared at the documents for a long time. He recognized the handwriting on one of the thank you notes. It belonged to his father. His heart sank as he read the message. To Margaret, for your loyalty and kindness, you will always have a place in this family. Attached to the note was a black and white picture of his father handing Margaret a small gift. Jonathan looked closer. It was the same silver locket he had found in Grace's bag. He now realized it had not been a secret gift or part of some hidden plan. It was a symbol of appreciation from a man who had trusted people, something Jonathan had forgotten how to do. His father had respected Margaret, and now her daughter had been wrongly accused, mistreated, and thrown out of the same house her mother once cared for. As Jonathan continued reading, the next part of the report brought an even deeper shock. It focused on Grace's professional history. The detective had gone through hospital records and testimonies. One section detailed the day Laura Wallace, Jonathan's wife, had passed away during emergency surgery. Grace had been working at the hospital that night as part of the nursing team. There was a note attached to the file, written by another nurse who had been on duty at the time. According to the note, before Laura went into surgery, she had spoken to Grace. Knowing the risks of the operation, Laura had taken a moment to speak to someone who showed her kindness. In that short conversation, she asked Grace if something happened to her to watch over Ethan. She said Grace reminded her of someone trustworthy. The hospital report confirmed the time, the names, and even had a signed document from Laura confirming her request. Jonathan's hands shook as he read those final words from his wife. For a few minutes he sat still, holding the report tightly. His breathing became heavy, and he didn't blink. His mind tried to make sense of everything. The woman he had thrown out, humiliated, and accused of betrayal was the same woman his wife had trusted with their son. Grace hadn't forced her way into their lives. She had been chosen by Laura and brought into the family's story through kindness, not manipulation. She had kept the locket because it belonged to her mother, who had served the Wallace family with honesty. Jonathan had let fear control his actions, and now he saw how wrong he had been. Grace wasn't a stranger with hidden motives. She was part of his family's past. His father had seen her mother as a loyal friend. His wife had seen her as a light in a moment of fear. But Jonathan had only seen shadows, and now he couldn't undo what had already been done. The guilt hit him hard. It wasn't just shame. It was the weight of everything he had destroyed. He remembered Grace's quiet voice when she said she had done nothing wrong. He remembered her holding Ethan's hand, playing with him, making him smile after months of sadness. He thought about the moment she had walked out of the mansion without fighting, without yelling, even though she had every reason to. She had carried the memory of her mother, honored his father, respected his wife's final wish, and still treated Ethan with love. And in return, Jonathan had doubted her, judged her, and thrown her out like a criminal. Now, all of that was clear, but it was too late. Grace was gone. Ethan was sick with sadness, barely eating, refusing to speak. The house was colder than ever. And Jonathan, once obsessed with control and fear, now sat alone, realizing he had pushed away the only person who truly brought warmth back into their lives. Jonathan read the report again, even though the words burned in his eyes. Every page was a reminder of his mistake. He had asked the detective to find the truth, but when it arrived, it wasn't what he had expected. The truth didn't prove that Grace was dangerous. It proved that Jonathan was. Dangerous in his fear, in his silence, in the way he treated others like enemies before giving them a chance. He thought about calling the agency, the newspapers, or maybe even the hospital to explain everything, to tell the truth. But none of that would change what Grace had been through. She had already lost her job, her peace, and her dignity, all because of him. The guilt consumed him in a way he had never experienced before. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and held the locket in his hand. It no longer felt like a piece of evidence. It felt like a wound, and Jonathan had placed it there himself. Driven by guilt, Jonathan couldn't wait any longer. After reading the detective's report again and again, and watching Ethan grow weaker with each passing day, he finally made a decision. He asked his driver to take him to the address listed in Grace's employment file. The trip wasn't long, but for Jonathan it felt endless. He sat in silence the whole way, holding the silver locket in his hand. When they arrived, the driver stopped in front of a small apartment building with worn bricks and a narrow entrance. Jonathan got out, walked up the stairs slowly, and knocked on the door. A few moments later, Grace opened it. She was surprised to see him. Her face showed confusion and tiredness, but she didn't close the door. Jonathan looked at her with heavy eyes and said in a soft voice that he had come to apologize. He admitted he had made the worst mistake of his life. Grace stood there, silent, unsure of what to say at first. Jonathan explained everything. He told her he had received the full report from the private detective and had read every page. He now knew that she had told the truth all along, that her mother had worked for his parents, and that the locket had been a gift of gratitude, not a secret. He also mentioned the hospital documents, the moment Laura had spoken to her, and how she had asked Grace to care for Ethan if anything happened to her. Jonathan's voice shook as he spoke. He said he had been blinded by fear, that he had pushed away the only person who had brought joy back into their lives. He said he had judged her without listening, without giving her a fair chance. Then he looked down, took a deep breath, and asked for forgiveness. He said he didn't deserve it, but he needed her to know that he was truly sorry for what he had done to her. Grace listened quietly, her expression softening as she heard his words. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke with a calm and sincere tone. She said she had never come to the Wallace mansion with bad intentions. She only wanted to fulfill two promises. One she had made to her mother, to return the kindness the Wallace family had shown them years ago, and one to Laura, to care for Ethan if the worst happened. She said those promises meant everything to her. Grace explained that she had never expected anything in return, only the chance to help. When Jonathan broke that trust, it had hurt more than she could say, not because she lost her job, but because she had truly cared for Ethan and had been treated like a stranger. Jonathan couldn't hold back anymore. He started to cry and said again that he was sorry from the bottom of his heart. After a few moments of silence, Jonathan looked at her and said he wanted her to come back, but not as an employee. He didn't want her to feel like a worker in his house. He wanted her to be part of the family because she already was, even if he had taken too long to realize it. Grace didn't answer right away. She was still hurt. She hadn't forgotten the humiliation, the cold accusations, or the way she had been treated like a criminal. But she looked into his eyes and saw real regret. She saw a man broken by guilt, someone who had finally opened his eyes. She didn't say yes, but she also didn't say no. After thinking for a moment, she said she would agree to visit Ethan. She needed time to decide what would come after that. Jonathan understood. He nodded and thanked her. Before leaving, he gently placed the locket on the table next to her and said it belonged with her. The next morning, Grace returned to the mansion. The staff watched her arrival with surprise. Some smiled, others held back tears. Jonathan stayed at the entrance, waiting quietly. Grace didn't say much as she entered. She asked to go straight to Ethan. The boy was in his room, lying in bed, looking pale and tired. When he saw her, his eyes widened. At first he looked shocked, unsure if he was dreaming. Then his face lit up. It was the first time he had smiled in weeks. Grace walked over to him and held his hand. Ethan started crying, repeating her name over and over. The room filled with emotion. A few of the staff stood at the door, watching with quiet admiration. Grace spoke to Ethan gently, told him she missed him and that everything would be okay. Ethan sat up slowly and, without warning, tried to move his legs. To everyone's surprise, his muscles responded. His legs moved slightly, but clearly. The room went silent in disbelief. A second later, the silence broke into claps and tears. Nurses and staff applauded as Ethan looked around, surprised by his own progress. Jonathan, who had just entered the room, stood frozen. He saw Grace by his son's side, just like in the video he had watched over and over. Ethan kept smiling, still holding Grace's hand, as if her presence alone had given him strength. Jonathan wiped his eyes, unable to hide his emotions. Grace remained calm, speaking softly to Ethan, encouraging him like she always had. No one said anything about the past. In that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Ethan had smiled, had moved, and had found hope again. And it had happened not through medicine or therapy, but through love, presence, and trust. Jonathan finally understood what he had almost destroyed. He stepped closer, placed his hand on Grace's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time, the mansion felt warm again, and everyone in that room felt it too. That afternoon, Jonathan made a decision that he knew would change everything. He asked for all the employees to gather in the main hall of the mansion. It was rare for him to call a meeting like this, so everyone came quickly, confused but curious. Grace stood near the back, still unsure about what was happening. Jonathan stood in front of them, looking nervous but determined. For a moment he stayed quiet, then cleared his throat and began to speak. He said he had made a serious mistake. He said he had let fear and suspicion guide his actions, and that his judgment had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Then he turned to Grace and announced that she would no longer be treated as a caregiver or a worker. From that moment on, she would be received as a member of the house. The room stayed silent at first. Then whispers spread. Jonathan looked at Grace and said, "I am sorry, and I ask for your forgiveness here in front of everyone." Her hands trembled and her eyes filled with tears. She had not expected this. She looked around and saw the faces of people who had once avoided her, now watching her with respect. She stepped forward slowly, still processing Jonathan's words. He had spoken with honesty, and for the first time, he had lowered his guard completely. Grace nodded and wiped her tears. She said softly that she forgave him. Then, without waiting for another word, she turned to Ethan, who was sitting nearby in his wheelchair, watching everything. Grace knelt beside him, hugged him tightly, and whispered something in his ear. Ethan smiled, leaned closer, and wrapped his arms around her neck. Grace looked into his eyes and asked, "Do you want to try standing again?" Ethan looked nervous, but he nodded. The room quieted again as everyone turned their attention to the boy. Grace placed her hands gently on his arms, ready to support him like she had done before. Ethan placed both hands on the sides of his wheelchair and pressed down with all his strength. His face showed how hard he was trying. Grace encouraged him in a calm voice, saying she believed in him and that he didn't need to rush. Slowly, shakily, he began to lift his body. Everyone watched in complete silence. His legs trembled, but he managed to support himself for a few seconds. He stood, not fully, not steadily, but enough for everyone to see the effort and progress. Jonathan, standing close by, was already crying. His hands covered his mouth, and tears fell down his face without control. He had never imagined seeing his son in that position again. Grace held Ethan steady, smiling through her own tears. The workers in the room began clapping, some wiping their eyes. What they witnessed wasn't just a physical achievement. It was something deeper, the result of love, patience, and trust finally restored in that house after so much pain and doubt. Jonathan stepped closer to them. He couldn't stop crying. He placed a hand on Grace's shoulder and another on Ethan's back. He didn't say anything at first. He couldn't. His voice was stuck in his throat. Grace looked up at him, and for the first time there was no barrier between them, no suspicion, no fear, just understanding. Ethan looked at his father and smiled through his tiredness. Jonathan finally found the words and said, "Thank you, both of you." Grace helped Ethan sit back down gently and kissed the top of his head. More people entered the hall after hearing the applause. Music played softly in the background, something light and cheerful that hadn't been heard in the house in a long time. Staff began talking, laughing, even hugging one another. The heavy silence that once filled the rooms was gone. The coldness in the mansion had started to disappear. Grace had not only helped Ethan stand again, she had helped the entire house begin to breathe again. The same cameras that once followed her every move now captured something different. There were no longer hidden motives, no scenes of control or suspicion. Instead, the footage showed joy, emotion, and unity. One camera caught Ethan smiling while Grace adjusted his wheelchair. Another captured Jonathan wiping his tears and laughing softly as he looked at them. Even the workers, who had once stayed quiet and distant, were now talking freely, helping prepare food and sharing memories from better times. Grace moved among them not as a stranger, but as someone respected. Jonathan no longer checked the footage to find faults. In fact, he didn't care about the cameras anymore. What mattered now was the feeling in the air, the sense that things were finally changing. It wasn't about perfection. It was about healing. And for the first time in years, the Wallace mansion wasn't a place of fear and isolation. It was becoming a home again, thanks to someone who had once been pushed away unfairly. In the middle of it all, Jonathan stepped back and looked around the hall. He took in the smiles, the music, and the lightness that filled the space. He realized how far they had come. Not just Ethan, but himself. He had spent years building walls, living in fear, shutting everyone out. And now, the person he had doubted the most was the one who had helped bring everything back to life. Grace stood nearby, still wiping tears from her face, but now they were tears of peace, not pain. Ethan looked stronger. The workers looked happier. And Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Forgiveness, not just from Grace, but from himself. The woman he had accused, the child he had neglected emotionally, the staff he had once treated with distance, they were all still here, giving him another chance. And the mansion, once silent and cold, now echoed with laughter and life. In the middle of it all stood Grace, the woman who had brought back not just health, but hope. Months had passed, and the Wallace mansion no longer looked or felt the same. The cold atmosphere that once filled the halls had disappeared completely. The rooms that were once quiet and heavy with silence were now filled with laughter, conversation, and life. The staff moved with ease, no longer afraid of making mistakes or being watched. The doors, once kept locked and guarded, now stayed open during the day. Music often played softly from speakers in the living room, and the garden was filled with signs of care and attention. Jonathan had changed more than anyone else. He no longer worked day and night in isolation. Instead, he spent more time with Ethan, going on walks, talking with the staff, and helping around the house. His presence was no longer intimidating, it was warm. He had learned to look people in the eye again. Most of all, he had learned to trust. The man who once lived in fear had made space for love and peace again. One of Jonathan's biggest decisions after everything that happened was to honor his wife's memory in a meaningful way. He created a foundation in Laura's name, dedicated to helping children with disabilities. The foundation offered therapy, emotional support, and access to medical resources for families in need. Jonathan didn't just put his money into it, he gave his time. He visited the center every week, helped with decisions, and spoke to the families. Grace played a big role in the project. She took on a leadership position and helped organize the programs. She worked directly with the staff and made sure each child received personal attention. Ethan often came with her. At first, he used a walker, but over time, his steps became stronger and more confident. The children at the foundation looked up to him, and he gave them hope. Seeing him walk, even with effort, inspired others. For Jonathan, the foundation was more than a project. It was a second chance to do good, this time with open eyes and an open heart. Inside the mansion, one special item was placed in the main living room for everyone to see. The silver locket that once caused confusion and pain was now framed and hung on the wall. A small plaque beneath it explained its meaning, a symbol of kindness that had passed from one generation to the next. Visitors often paused to look at it, asking about its story. Jonathan would explain that it belonged to a woman who served his family with loyalty and whose daughter brought healing when they needed it most. The locket wasn't just decoration, it was a reminder. It reminded everyone in the house of the importance of gratitude, humility, and forgiveness. It also reminded them how wrong judgments can be when made in fear. Grace, who once held that locket close as her only connection to the past, now saw it celebrated for what it truly represented: love, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of people who choose to do what's right, even when no one is watching. The security system that once watched every corner of the house was no longer active. Jonathan had all the hidden cameras removed. He said they no longer belonged in a place that was meant to feel like home. He understood now that protecting your heart by closing it off only causes more harm. The walls had ears before, but now they held laughter. The spaces once filled with suspicion now welcomed guests, children, and conversation. Jonathan reopened the gates to his estate. He allowed the community to come in for events hosted by the foundation. Families visited, children played, and volunteers helped around the garden and kitchen. Grace became known to everyone, not as a former worker, but as a core part of the family. She was involved in everything, always patient and thoughtful. Her connection with Ethan remained strong, and her respect for Jonathan had grown as he changed into a better man. Their lives had shifted together, healed by truth and shaped by new beginnings. Ethan's progress continued with each passing week. He still had moments of weakness, but his steps became more regular and steady. With support and therapy, he began walking longer distances. The staff celebrated every milestone with him. Grace stood beside him during each session, encouraging him without pressure. Jonathan watched with pride, always nearby. The relationship between father and son had grown stronger. They spent time reading, playing games, and talking about things they never used to discuss. For the first time in years, Ethan felt heard and seen. He smiled more often. He invited friends to visit. His room, once quiet and filled with medical equipment, was now colorful and full of life. The house itself had become something new, a place of support and joy. Grace's presence had changed everything, and no one questioned her place there anymore. She was no longer a visitor, a caregiver, or a temporary guest. She was part of the family, not just in title, but in every daily action and shared moment. The Wallace mansion had been many things: a fortress, a place of fear, a house filled with silence, but now it was a true home. Grace had helped rebuild not only Ethan's strength, but also Jonathan's ability to feel, trust, and forgive. The past had left deep scars, but it had also opened the door for redemption. The house, once cold and guarded, was now full of love. The laughter of children echoed in the halls, meals were shared around a full table, and music played not to cover silence, but to celebrate life. The silver locket, once hidden in a drawer, now told a story of second chances. Grace had become more than a symbol. She was the heart of it all. Jonathan, now free from fear, welcomed people into his life again. He no longer hid behind walls or cameras. He had let go of the past and embraced what truly mattered. And in that house, hope had finally come home to stay. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.